It's the afternoon of October 27, 1962, and you are currently baking alive inside a steel tube at the bottom of the Sargasso Sea. You're a Soviet sailor on the B-59, a diesel-electric submarine built for the freezing Arctic, but currently hiding in the tropical waters of the Caribbean. The air conditioning has been dead for days. The temperature inside is pushing 115 degrees. The carbon dioxide is so thick, you are panting like a dog just to get oxygen to your brain. And to make matters worse, the United States Navy is currently dropping explosives on your head. The hull is rattling. The lights are flickering. Your captain, exhausted, dehydrated, and completely disconnected from Moscow, is convinced World War III has already started. So, he gives the order, arm the special weapon. He wants to launch a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo and sink the nearest American aircraft carrier. You are seconds away from participating in the end of human civilization. Chapter 1. The Arctic Submarines in a Tropical Oven. To understand how the fate of the world ended up in the sweaty hands of a few guys in a broken submarine, we need to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, we don't need to talk about the whole crisis. You know the basics. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sneaks nuclear missiles into Cuba. U.S. President John F. Kennedy finds out. And for 13 days in October, the entire world holds its breath while two superpowers have a massive geopolitical staring contest. But what people often forget is that the missiles on the ground in Cuba weren't the only nukes Khrushchev sent. He also sent a secret escort of 4 Foxtrot-class submarines, known as the 69th Torpedo Submarine Brigade, out into the Atlantic. Their mission? To protect Soviet transport ships heading to Cuba. There was just one massive glaring problem. The Foxtrot-class submarine was a magnificent piece of engineering. If you were fighting in the freezing, icy waters of the Barents Sea, it was not built for the tropics. It was like wearing a heavy winter parka into a sauna. As historian Michael Dobbs points out in his book 1 Minute to Midnight, the Soviet naval planners fundamentally misunderstood the environment they were sending their men into. As soon as the subs hit the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, their cooling systems completely failed. To make this real, let's look at the diary of Captain Anatoly Andreev, the commander of another sub in the brigade, the B-4. He wrote, "It's getting harder and harder to breathe. The temperature in the diesel compartments is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The sailors are fainting one by one." That wasn't an exaggeration. Sailors were literally losing 5 to 10 pounds a day just from sweating. They were restricted to 1 glass of water a day. The air scrubbers were failing, meaning carbon dioxide was building up to toxic levels. Men were covered in rashes, hallucinating in the dark, and entirely cut off from radio communication with Moscow because the American fleet was swarming the surface above them. Which brings us to the B-59, commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. Savitsky was a capable officer, but by October 27th, his nerves were entirely shredded. He hadn't heard from Soviet command in days. For all he knew, Washington had already nuked Moscow, and right at that moment, the American Navy found him. Chapter 2. Swat the Mosquito. While the Soviet sailors were cooking in their own sweat, the U.S. Navy was executing President Kennedy's quarantine of Cuba. They had essentially drawn a giant line in the ocean and said, "Nobody crosses this." The Navy had an elite anti-submarine warfare division, and they were very good at their jobs. On October 27th, a day that would later be known in the White House as Black Saturday, the U.S. fleet located the B-59. They surrounded it with a strike group centered around the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, supported by nearly a dozen destroyers. Now, time for an ELI-5 analogy to explain the massive miscommunication that was about to happen. Imagine you and your roommate are in a bitter argument, and you lock yourself in the bathroom. Your roommate starts aggressively knocking on the door to get you to come out and talk. But here's the catch. You have noise-canceling headphones on, the room is actively on fire, and you're holding a bazooka. To him, it's a polite, firm knock. To you, it feels like an ambush, and your finger is on the trigger. The U.S. Navy wanted the B-59 to surface so they could identify it. To do this, a destroyer called the USS Beale started dropping what they called signaling depth charges. These were essentially practice explosives. They were loud as hell, but they didn't have enough explosive payload to crack the hull of a submarine. The Navy even broadcasted a message on international frequencies explaining that they were just dropping practice charges as a signal to surface. The problem? The B-59 wasn't monitoring that frequency. They were too deep to catch the radio waves anyway. So put yourself in the shoes of a U.S. Navy sailor on the surface. we have the documented experience of Gary Slaughter, a 23-year-old communications officer on the USS Coney. Looking back, Slaughter described the mood on the American ships as tense but controlled. They were just running a textbook sub-hunting exercise. They had zero idea that the submarine below them was armed with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. U.S. intelligence believed the Soviets hadn't equipped their subs with nuclear weapons yet. Spoiler alert, they absolutely had. Chapter 3. The Guy Who Saved the World. Down in the dark, sweltering belly of the B-59, those practice charges didn't sound like practice. They sounded like the beginning of World War III. Every time a charge went off, the entire submarine violently shook. Lights shattered. Men who were already delirious from carbon dioxide poisoning were thrown into the bulkheads. Captain Savitsky finally snapped. According to later testimony from the crew, Savitsky lost his temper completely. He ordered the ship's special weapon, the nuclear torpedo, to be armed and prepared for launch. We have accounts of his exact words in that moment, and they are terrifying. He reportedly screamed, "We're gonna blast them now! We will die! But we will sink them all! We will not disgrace our Navy!" He wasn't bluffing. The torpedo was brought into the tube. The launch codes were ready. But Soviet protocol for launching a nuclear weapon from a submarine required a very specific failsafe. It wasn't like a movie where the captain just turns a key and pushes a big red button. To launch the nuke, 3 specific officers had to unanimously agree. First, you needed the captain, Savitsky. He was a hard yes. Second, you needed the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. In the Soviet military, the political officer was there to make sure everyone stayed loyal to the party. Maslenikov looked at Savitsky, looked at the shaking submarine, and gave his approval. That's 2 yeses. The third vote belonged to the second-in-command, a 36-year-old officer named Vasili Arkhipov. Now, Vasili Arkhipov wasn't just any officer. He was the flotilla's chief of staff, and he happened to be on the B-59 by sheer luck of assignments. Even more importantly, Arkhipov had seen firsthand what radiation does to a human body. A year earlier, he had been the executive officer on the K-19, a Soviet nuclear submarine that suffered a catastrophic reactor leak. Arkhipov had helped organize the heroic, suicidal effort to fix the reactor, watching his own men absorb fatal doses of radiation. He knew exactly what a nuclear explosion meant. It wasn't abstract to him. It was a nightmare he had already lived. So, when Savitsky and Maslenikov looked at Arkhipov and demanded his key to launch the weapon, Arkhipov did something incredibly difficult. In a 115-degree tube, surrounded by screaming, suffocating men, with depth charges rocking the hull, he simply said, "No." Chapter 4. The Long Breath. Historians genuinely debate the exact details of the argument that followed. Some sources say it was a calm, tense standoff. Others point to a chaotic shouting match that lasted for an agonizing amount of time. But what we do know for an absolute fact is that Vasili Arkhipov refused to budge. He managed to talk Savitsky down off the ledge. He pointed out that the depth charges were hitting exactly port and starboard. They were too precise. If the Americans wanted to sink them, they would have been hit directly. The charges were a signal. Arkhipov essentially said, "Captain, they aren't trying to kill us. They're asking us to come up." And miraculously, Savitsky listened. The B-59 blew its ballast tanks and broke the surface of the Sargasso Sea. Gary Slaughter, the American officer on the USS Coney, watched as this massive, rusted, algae-covered Soviet beast rose out of the water right in the middle of the American fleet. The Soviet sailors opened the hatch, desperately gulping down fresh air. No shots were fired. No nuclear torpedoes were launched. The Americans offered them food and water, which the Soviets proudly refused. And eventually, the B-59 turned around and began the humiliating, grueling journey back to Russia. When they finally got home, they weren't greeted as heroes. The Soviet Naval Command was furious that they had been forced to surface and expose themselves to the Americans. One admiral famously told the returning submarine crews, "It would have been better if you had gone down with your ships." Which, let's be honest, is a staggeringly terrible thing to say to guys who just spent a month cooking in a steel tube. Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, summed up this entire incident perfectly. He said simply, "A guy named Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." History is usually taught as a series of massive, sweeping movements. Treaties signed by men in nice suits, grand economic shifts, and invisible political forces. But sometimes, it really just comes down to one guy. Sometimes, humanity survives simply because one exhausted, sweating, stubborn guy in a broken submarine decides to be the one person in the room who refuses to panic. And that is a terrifying, beautiful reality to live with. Next time, we'll talk about the Soviet computer glitch of 1983 and the man who looked at a screen telling him 5 American nukes were inbound and decided to just go get a cup of coffee.